16%. That's quite a number, isn't it? 16% of adults in New Zealand reporting moderate to severe driving anxiety.
It really is. Makes you stop and think.
Yeah. So today, we're doing a deep dive into exactly that. Driving phobia. You might also hear it called driving anxiety, Vehophobia, and maxophobia.
Or even just driving-related fear, DRF. Lots of names for it.
And it's more than just being a bit nervous before getting on a motorway, right?
Oh, absolutely. We're talking about a fear that's intense, it's persistent, related to being in traffic, really. And it gets to the point where it significantly impacts someone's life.
How so?
Well, think about it. It can genuinely limit job opportunities. If you can't drive or you're too terrified to, certain jobs just become impossible. It really dictates things.
I gather it's not always the same level of fear for everyone.
Not at all. For some, yeah, it might just be specific things like highways or really dense traffic that sets it off. But for others, it can range from just, a background level of unease to a severe full-blown phobia where even the thought of driving is paralyzing.
Wow. That variability is interesting.
Exactly. And that's partly why we wanted to look into this. It affects more people than you might initially think, and it's often misunderstood.
Right. So whether you listening feel that yourself sometimes, or maybe you know someone who does, or you're just curious.
Yeah, or just interested in how anxiety works. We want to shed some light on it today.
And we're basing this on psychological research, assessment methods, that kind of thing. Solid sources.
Definitely. The aim is really to unpack the main aspects for you. What are the symptoms, what causes it, and importantly, what can help.
Okay.
We want to give you clear, insightful information, but, without getting bogged down in overly technical stuff.
Sounds good. So let's jump in. What does driving phobia actually feel like? What are the symptoms people experience?
Well, the first thing to remember is how varied it can be. Person to person, it's different. But we generally see symptoms across three main areas: physical, cognitive, so thoughts and feelings, and behavioral, how people act.
Let's start with the physical then. What's happening in the body?
Physically, you often get that classic anxiety response. Increased sweating, heart racing.
Tachycardia.
That's the one, yeah, tachycardia. And even hyperventilation sometimes, feeling like you just can't catch your breath.
That sounds pretty intense. And mentally, what's going on in someone's head?
Cognitively, people might feel a bit detached, almost like things aren't real or they're watching themselves.
Depersonalization.
Sort of, yeah.
Yeah.
And there can be these really powerful thoughts about losing control, crashing, even when the situation is actually quite safe. Those thoughts alone can be terrifying.
I can imagine. And then that must affect how people behave.
Absolutely. Behaviorally, the biggest thing is avoidance. It's natural, right? If something scares you that much, you avoid it.
Makes sense. You just don't drive.
Exactly. Or you avoid certain routes, certain times of day. But the problem with phobias, and this is crucial, is that the avoidance, while it brings relief now,
It makes it worse long term.
precisely, it reinforces the fear. It teaches your brain, see, avoiding that kept you safe. So the fear gets stronger.
Now, you mentioned earlier that accidents are a big factor. How does a crash lead to this phobia?
That's a really common pathway. When a maxophobia develops after a serious collision, it often goes hand in hand with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder.
Oh.
So the person might have intrusive thoughts like flashbacks of the accident, nightmares.
Re-experiencing it.
Yes. And that hypervigilance, always being on edge, that's typical of PTSD too, and it feeds right into the driving fear.
And the sources mentioned something called phantom brake syndrome. What's that about? Sounds intriguing.
It is, isn't it? Phantom brake syndrome. It's fascinating. You often see it in people who were skilled, experienced drivers before a bad accident. Now, when they're a passenger, especially if they feel the driver isn't reacting, maybe braking late, they'll instinctively slam their foot down on the floor where the brake would be.
Even though there's no pedal there.
Exactly. It's like that motor program for braking in danger is so ingrained, the trauma and anxiety can trigger it involuntarily.
Yeah.
It really shows that lingering feeling of being out of control.
Wow. That paints a picture. Does driving phobia often show up alongside other anxiety issues?
Yes, comorbidity is quite common. You might see it with panic disorder, sudden, intense fear attacks, or agoraphobia.
Fear of places you can't easily escape.
Right, or other specific phobias, even social phobia sometimes, maybe worrying about being judged for their driving or their anxiety.
So it's rarely just one thing in isolation.
Often not. Even if the phobia clearly started after a crash, many survivors report a more general anxiety afterwards. It's part of the adjustment, not just about the car, but a wider sense of unease.
And the physical recovery from the accident itself must play a role too. Pain, maybe?
Definitely. If someone has persistent pain from injuries or trouble sleeping because of the pain, maybe post-concussion symptoms, whiplash, all of that can make the amaxophobia
Right.
worse. And like we said with PTSD, those flashbacks, especially vivid images of the crash or injuries, are powerful triggers for driving anxiety. Research actually finds pretty strong links, significant correlations between PTSD scores and driving anxiety scores.
Okay, so we've got a handle on the symptoms, the PTSD link, the phantom brake. Let's shift to the causes. Where does this typically start? You mentioned categories.
Yeah, researchers tend to group the onset into about three main categories.
And the most common one is traffic collisions, as we've discussed.
By far, that's the most frequent trigger reported. Studies show a really significant chunk of people injured in crashes go on to develop driving fear.
What kind of numbers are we talking?
Well, some studies, like Beck and Coffey, found around 25 to 33% of injury crash survivors develop it. Others, like Hickling and Blanchard or Couch and colleagues, found even higher rates, sometimes way up there, like 40, 50, even over 70% in some groups.
That's huge.
Yeah,
Really underscores the psychological impact.
it really does. And an interesting point is that many of these people were experienced, confident drivers before the crash.
Right.
Afterwards, they might still believe they're capable drivers, maybe even safer than others now. But the discomfort, the anxiety is just too overwhelming.
So it's not about skill, it's about the feeling.
Exactly, the intense emotional reaction. And that fear can get tied to specific things, like just being near big trucks might set it off.
Or even just getting in the car.
For some, yes, or even just thinking about a journey they need to make later. It can really spread.
But it's not only people who've been in accidents. What about new drivers or passengers?
Good point. No, it's not exclusively post-crash. Some novice drivers, even without any accident history, can develop it. Same for some passengers.
Why might that happen?
In some cases, it might be part of a broader agoraphobia, like we touched on. The car feels like a situation that's hard to escape if panic strikes.
So the root isn't always a single trauma.
Not always. Other factors can contribute too. Just a general fear of losing control, perhaps, or constantly worrying about getting into an accident.
Maybe they saw bad driving.
Exactly. Exposure to unsafe conditions, even if nothing happened to them. Pre-existing anxiety disorders like GAD or unrelated PTSD can make someone more vulnerable.
And maybe just how they think about risk.
Yes, cognitive distortions play a role too. Overestimating the danger, thinking the worst is likely to happen on the road, that can feed the fear.
It's definitely complex. So when someone seeks help, how do clinicians figure out the specifics of their anxiety? You mentioned questionnaires.
Right. Psychological questionnaires are really helpful tools. They let clinicians assess how intense the anxiety is and what specific things trigger it, situations, thoughts, feelings.
Can you give us some examples? What about the driving behavior survey?
Sure. The DBS, Driving Behavior Survey, has 20 items. People rate how much they agree on a 1 to 7 scale. An item might be something like, I have trouble staying in the correct lane. It looks at specific driving actions.
Okay. And the driving cognition questionnaire, DCQ.
DCQ, yeah. Also 20 items, but scored 0 to 4. This one gets more into the thoughts. Interestingly, some items touch on social anxiety.
Like worrying what others think.
Exactly, like people will think I'm a bad driver. But it's worth noting, those kinds of self-image worries seem less common in people whose phobia started after a crash, especially if they were confident drivers before.
Their fear is more about the trauma itself.
Often, yes. Then there's the DRA's Driving and Riding Avoidance Scale.
Focuses on avoidance.
Yes, 20 items, 0 to 4 scoring, asking about avoiding various driving or passenger situations. But, as some researchers point out, you have to be careful interpreting it.
How so?
Well, someone might avoid driving in the city and take the train because it's faster or cheaper, not purely out of fear, so context matters.
Good point. Avoidance isn't always phobia. Now, the vehicle anxiety questionnaire, that one sounded specific.
It is, developed by James Whetstone, specifically for car crash survivors. It's really tailored for people who were likely experienced drivers before the trauma.
What does it look at?
It covers 6 main areas: things people do to compensate while driving, anxiety as a passenger, physical symptoms, how it limits their mobility, avoidance, and the impact on their life and relationships. scored 0 to 3.
And it compares before and after.
Clinically, yes, they often ask patients to rate driver and passenger anxiety 1 to 10 before and after the collision.
Right.
Studies show it distinguishes well between anxious and non-anxious survivors and correlates well with other anxiety measures.
Seems thorough for that group. What about Steiner's automobile anxiety inventory?
The AAI. Yeah, Leon Steiner's. It's 23 items, mostly simple yes-no. It also has good validity and focuses a lot on comparing anxiety before the crash versus after.
Simple language is good too.
Yes, makes it accessible if reading is difficult for someone.
So with these different tools, is it best to use just one or maybe combine them?
If time allows, combining them can be really useful. Whetstone's VAQ, Steiner's AAI, and Whetstone's other one, the DAQ,
DAQ.
Driving Anxiety Questionnaire. This one lists specific driving situations, highways, night driving, rain, etc. The person rates their anxiety for each, as a driver and as a passenger.
They're very specific.
Incredibly useful for therapists planning exposure therapy. It breaks it right down. It even specifically asks about the phantom brake syndrome.
Tailored treatment then. And the Gutierrez questionnaire.
Yes, that's another option. Items 54 to 65 look at driving anxiety, physical reactions, feelings, avoidance, phantom brake. It also has a checklist of anxious situations, again, useful for planning therapy like systematic desensitization.
It's clear there are good ways to assess this properly,
Hmm.
which leads to the big question. What helps? What are the treatments?
Well, the most common and generally effective approach is behavior therapy.
Okay.
And within that, a technique called systematic desensitization is very widely used.
How does that work in simple terms?
It's basically gradual exposure. The therapist helps the person create a list, a hierarchy of feared driving situations, from least scary to most scary.
Like starting with just sitting in the car, maybe.
Exactly. Then maybe driving down a quiet street, then a busier one, and so on. At each step, the person uses relaxation techniques they've learned.
To counter the anxiety.
Right. The goal is to slowly break that link between the situation and the fear, replacing anxiety with relaxation step by step.
Makes sense. Confronting it gently.
Yeah.
Are there other approaches? I think the sources mentioned virtual reality.
Yes, VR therapy is an emerging and really promising treatment.
Using VR headsets.
Yeah, using game-like setups to put the person in realistic virtual driving environments. It's safe, it's controlled.
So they can practice facing the fear without the real-world risk.
Precisely. They can encounter triggers, heavy traffic, merging, whatever scares them repeatedly in the VR world. Research shows it can significantly reduce their distress.
And maybe make them more willing to try real driving later.
Exactly. It can be a great stepping stone towards real-world exposure therapy, building confidence in a controlled way.
Fascinating how technology can help there. So this has been a really insightful look at driving phobia.
Hope it's been useful.
Definitely. So just to recap quickly, driving phobia or amaxophobia, it's a serious anxiety issue. Lots of different symptoms, physical, mental, behavioral.
Often linked to accidents and PTSD, but not always. Other factors can play a role too.
Right. And we have these psychological questionnaires to really understand it in detail for each person.
And importantly, there are effective treatments. Behavior therapy, like systematic desensitization, and now VR therapy too, offer real hope.
And it's key to remember, as you said, everyone's experience with this is unique.
Absolutely. It manifests differently for each person. The triggers, the intensity, how it impacts their life, it varies a lot.
So if anything we've talked about today sounds familiar, either for you or someone you know,
Don't hesitate to look for more information or perhaps talk to a professional.
yeah, understanding it is definitely the first step.
Always.
And maybe one final thought to leave our listeners with. Given how much this anxiety can affect someone's independence, their work, just their daily life, how could we as a society, maybe our infrastructure, our support systems, how could we better support people dealing with driving phobia?
That's a really important question. How can we make things more accommodating for this often invisible struggle? Definitely something we're thinking about.